Welcome to my transparent watercolor tutorial on the porch. The colors used for this painting were quinacridone coral, quinacridone violet, mauve, and sap green. Those four colors are the primary colors, and I used these almost straight off my palette, which I don't often do. The other two colors that I used in this were pyrrole red and royal blue, and I only used those two colors when I wanted to create a darker valued green. The photograph on the right is a reference for this painting. I've made some changes to the position of the flower pot and some of the other shapes to come up with a composition more to my liking. I didn't like the positioning of the flower pot because it's too much in the center, and that isn't really where you want your center of interest. And I was going to pick some element of this flower pot to zoom in on the center of interest. So I've moved it to the left. I've come in with a closer view, and I've allowed some of these shapes of flowers and foliage to run off to the edge of the paper. Here I've lightly drawn my composition with a B-leaded pencil, and I've probably overdrawn this from what I would normally do. However, I wanted to provide a template that people could use should they want to try and paint this. So I've put a little bit more detail in this than what I am accustomed to doing. I'm going to begin my painting by putting random marks of color around the composition in the areas where the flowers are going to be. I'm using quinacridone coral pretty much straight off my palette. As I said, I don't often do that, but the subject matter and the palette colors that I've chosen are going to allow that. So I'm putting these marks of quinacridone coral, and they're rather hard edged, so I want to soften those up and diffuse this color a little bit because it's too early for me to start defining the hard shapes of these flowers. So I'm taking my fine mist spray bottle and I'm going to diffuse this color a little bit and let it run and get some of these colors to kind of run together, some of these marks, and those will start to be the underpainting for that area as the painting develops. Now I'm going to come in a similar manner using quinacridone violet. Quinacridone violet is a fairly dark valued, a very kind of rich red violet tone, and it's a nice color. And again, I'm just putting some random marks, and I'm going to soften those, and then those colors are going to mingle with the quinacridone coral and add to what I've already put down with the quinacridone coral. So here I've completely dried my paper, and it's completely flat. And this is something that I do continuously through my process. I know people always ask about buckling. I don't really have much of a problem. I use 140 pound, but I continually dry my paper through my process. The other thing I want to point out at this stage is that with watercolor, once you dry it, it becomes much lighter. So sometimes you think that you're putting down a very dark value, and after you've dried it, it's much lighter. And sometimes you recognize that, and sometimes you don't. You still have the memory of the dark value you put down with your brush. So that's something you need to be aware of, that you need to go back and check and make sure that the values that you thought you were putting down with your brush are in fact what you have on your paper after it's completely dry. So I'm going to come in now with some sap green, and just as with the other colors, it's pretty much straight off the palette. Later on, I'll use some pyrrole red and royal blue to give myself a dark value green, but right now I'm just using this right off my palette, and I'm taking a similar approach that I did with the flowers. I'm laying down this tone. I'm going to take my spray bottle here, and I'm going to soften the edges. I'm going to diffuse the color, and you can see that I'm not trying to paint within the lines on these leaves. Right now it's too early to think leaf. I'm thinking larger shapes. So I'm thinking that large green shape that I just put down, and later I'll come in and I'll carve those leaf shapes out of it. The same here in this area. I'm not worried about painting within the lines of the leaves. Now I am painting in between the railings because I want this green to be the leaves to suggest that they're going behind the railings. But in the other areas, I'm thinking overall shape And actually that area between the railing is a continuation of the shape to the right. They're all one unit here, this green tone. And I work with larger shapes to start, and then I come in and start working with smaller shapes, getting more detail, getting darker value. So here I've put this green tone on a few different areas in the painting, and I've softened them up with the spray bottle. And you can see I'm trying to create a little bit of a directional flow too, the way I spray that, and kind of coming from downward from left to right. And that's something I'll do in some of my paintings, especially some of these florals, to try and kind of give the suggestion of some motion or some activity. Earlier I had said I had changed my composition to one more that was more of my liking, and I'm going to put this grid that I have over top of this painting, and I'm using the rule of thirds here, where I divide it in 3 parts vertically and 3 parts horizontally, and the spot where those lines intersect are the best places to put the center of interest, or the focal point. It's called the rule of thirds. I have a video on that, or you can look it up on the internet. And for this painting, I'm going to choose that upper left quadrant where that intersection where those 2 lines intersect, and I'm going to try and make that area where those flowers are my center of interest right there. You hear me mention shapes a lot, and as I said, I start working with the larger shapes first, and right now I'm not thinking individual flower shapes here. I'm thinking this large mass of flowers as a shape, and I'm thinking about this bowl that the flowers are in as a shape, and the negative space surrounding the bowl and the flowers as a shape. And then there's a shadowed area that falls underneath those flowers on the bowl. Again, another shape. Those break this composition up into several large shapes. I'm going to come in with some brush marks of sap green and a wash of sap green in some areas to help better define some of these shapes and start to set things apart. So I'm taking this sap green and I'm painting in between the railing, beside it, and around these leaves a little bit to start to bring some form to the composition. Now I'm going to take some of that green and help to define the shape of that bowl. So I'm still around a middle value with my colors. I'm just putting some touches of green around this, and I'm going to gradate it out with some water and soften that up, soften the edge up a little bit. Here I'm going to start to bring this kind of violet tone, it's a mauve actually, into what will become the shape of the shadow that's kind of underneath these flowers. So this mauve is straight off the palette again, and it's an interesting color. I like it. It's a nice purple tone. So I'm continuing on with this same mauve off my palette, and I'm painting the space that is the shadow under the leaves and the flowers, and it's falling in between the railings. I'm going to take some of this mixture, I'm going to use it to indicate the edge of the bowl, and I just put a little bit of this value down and I stop it at that railing and then soften it up a little bit. Here I'm going to put some of that mauve up in the top right corner of my composition to help balance where this color is at throughout the painting. It helps lead the eye over there from as you follow that purple shadow. Now I'm going to move back to my quinacridone coral, but in a heavier mixture of pigment with less water in it. So it's much darker, much brighter. And I'm just giving the indication of some of those flower shapes. They're kind of a 4-petal flower that's in this bowl. Now the thing I don't want is I don't want these to all look like they're the same size, the same shape, and just position across this with the same spacing, which is kind of how it is in the photo. So that's why I have this overall big shape, and I'm putting some of these random petal shapes in, but then I'm going to come in and I'm going to touch that again with a fine mist spray to soften things up and put a little bit more mystery in, and where the whole definition of each flower is. So now I'm going to start to use a darker valued green here, and this is some sap green mixed with some pyrrole red to neutralize it a little bit, and then some royal blue added in to help deepen the value. And what I'm doing is starting to put some dark values on the negative edges of these leafy shapes, and I'm painting in between these railings. But you'll see me move around, and I'm just putting some darker tones around all these areas a little bit. As I put these darker green tones in, I'm trying to, with every mark, help define an object other than the space that I'm actually painting. So by painting around the exterior edges of these leaf shapes with this dark value, I start to bring those leaf shapes out without really even touching them with a paintbrush. I'm really just touching the area around the leaf shape. You can see that by the careful placement of these marks that I can start to make the shape of the leaf more believable. And I'm not painting a lot of area, and I'm not painting the leaves. I'm just giving the indication of where dark values fall, and it starts to show separation between the background and the foreground. By taking some of these darker green tones, these dark values, and start to put some marks in between these railings, I start to reinforce the fact that all these green shapes mostly are behind this railing. Now I'm going to make a few marks here that are going to do two things. One, they're going to help define the edge of that railing as I start to where it would be coming out. Two, I'm trying to paint the brush strokes in a manner that it contours the bowl that I'm making this mark on, in essence. And here I'm softening the edges. But it's to help give form to this bowl. If we look to the right side here, this bowl is sitting on, it's a porch, but I've actually made it look like a rock. So I have that edge that needs defined, and I could do that a couple ways. One, I could put a wash that would go against that. We're on the exterior edge of that rock type shape, and I could just put a big wash. But what I'm going to do is to try and create a little bit more interest. I'm just taking some marks and giving the indication of a leaf or vine coming down, and I'm doing this all by working in negative space. So here I've given a suggestion of some leaves coming down, some vines, but everything's stopping right at this rock. Now, right there, I've made a leaf shape, And I'm not going to be able to really leave it like that because that right there, that's a bad tangent. The edge of the leaf is ending on the edge of my rock, and you don't want that. So I'm just going to try and touch that up with a Kleenex, make it disappear a little bit. I'm going to paint over it a little, give you an indication of maybe a vine or something there. But you don't want, normally, you don't want edge to edge in your composition. It's called a tangent. And you don't want the end of something to end on the edge of something else. You want to just overlap a little or have it come short, but you don't want the edge of one object or one shape to end directly on the edge of another shape normally. You can see now, though, how you can see where the edge of that rock is just because of the negative painting and giving the suggestion of some vines and darker areas around leaf shapes, and they all stop at the edge of that rock, which starts to suggest that there's a solid edge there, even though I haven't really painted that surface. I need to start building some depth, so I began to put in a darker value wash, which is this mauve, and this is straight off the palette. Mauve's a pretty dark color. So here I'm painting around these railings with a dark blue to give the suggestion of the depth that's going on to the left of this pot of flowers. Here I'm starting to take some of the quinacridone violet and start to give a little bit more shape to some of these flower areas. And I'm not going to do this everywhere. I'm just going to do it for the most part around my centers of interest. And that, if you remember the diagram I put on, or the grid, this top left corner is the area where I want to have my center of interest. Here I've applied some of the quinacridone violet, and then I hit it with that fine mist spray. And I like the effect it gives. It gives that kind of gradation of the color, and it just diffuses it out and creates an area of interest that's different than some of the other areas of the composition, which helps draw the eye in there where I want my center of interest. I want to tell a little bit more of the story of what's going on with this pot. So I'm going to take a very dark value here, and I'm painting in negative space. So by making these brush marks in negative space, I'm reinforcing the edge of this pot and making it more pronounced. So this is the beauty of working with negative space. You can help describe an object without actually even painting the object. It's like I didn't do anything else to the surface of the bowl, but just by making marks in negative space, it defines that edge. And here I'm just making a few very small brush marks, a few dots and dashes, and it's enough to suggest that that pot is sitting on that stone surface. I'm putting some of the sap green down, pretty full strength with a little bit of water in it. And I'm going to take my spray bottle, I'm going to diffuse that color out. And I like the effect that I get with this spray, and how you put this, your color mixture down, and when you spray it, and it fuses that color, it gives like a glaze over an area. And it creates an interesting effect, I think. I'm going to do the same thing here. I've put the sap green down, now I'm going to spray it, and you can see how it puts just a light green layer on top of some of that area, and it's gradates very nicely just because of it's being done with that fine sprayer. now I have a very dark value. It's this mauve at pretty much full strength with a little bit of water in it. And everything right now is kind of the same in terms of value, the size of the shapes, and I need a larger, darker value area. I need to take this area and make it a little seem more in the background than the foreground. So I'm taking this mauve and I'm putting it on either side of that railing and a little bit more water, and I'm going to tone that area down with this mixture, and it's going to make it seem a little bit more like it's in the background than the foreground. I'm taking that same value of mauve and I'm working it a little bit around the composition and trying to give some more dimension to my painting, a little more depth. So I'm using this dark valued mauve to suggest that this is a heavily shadowed area, and it has these leaves more towards the foreground. And here again I've taken that spray bottle and softened the edges and diffused that color a little bit. I was planning on letting these railings kind of get lost in space here with lost edges, but I decided I'm going to give it a little bit more definition. So I'm going to paint positively here and within the interior edges of this railing with a dark value to start to define a little bit more of its shape. So I'm painting what would be the shadow side of it with a darker value, and as I go up the railing here, this shape, I'm going to let that fade a little bit, and it becomes defined as you move up the railing. It starts to become defined by the painting in negative space around it. So while it enters the page, I've painted on in the positive the positive aspects of that shape, and let it transition to where it's being defined by negative space as it gets up into the green area with a darker value on the outside edge as opposed to the inside edge. So as these railings here enter the page, they're a dark value on light, and then as they move up the page, they become a lighter value against a dark background. So it kind of shifts from a positive painting to a negative painting situation. I'm going to treat this smaller rail a little differently. I put a darker value higher up on the top of a middle value, and then let the bottom get lost a little bit. I don't want them all look the same. I want to have some variation. So I've treated that one a little differently than I did the other two. One of the things I like to do is take a wet brush and do some lifting, just to give the indication of just some little kind of grassy, wispy shapes, some linear shapes here. And I drag that wet brush through the darker value to try and get it to lift off a little bit, and then I drag the pigment that is coming off onto a whiter light value area, and it gives just a little bit of a darker mark. So you can see there I'm dragging that purple tone and I'm trying to lift off in the dark area, but I'm pulling it down so that it indicates or gives a suggestion of a mark over the light area. So same here with the green. I'm able to get a little bit of lifting, and I drag that green out to a lighter value area. And as I'll come back in here when I'm done with this, and in some spots I'll paint around the edges of these linear shapes that I've lifted off to make them a little bit more defined. I'm going to start working with a dark value green here, and to get that dark value I've taken my sap green, I've mixed it with pyrrole red, which neutralizes it somewhat, and then I've added royal blue, which makes it a much darker value. And that's how I arrived at this green this dark green mixture. And I'm just carefully putting some marks in here just to give some depth and help define a few shapes. And I'm just going to carry this value around the composition a little bit, putting some of these marks. Continuing with this dark valued green, and I'm taking it to a few other areas here in the painting, a little bit closer to the edge. And you can tell that I haven't built up or haven't put the same amount of detail in this area that I'm working in. It's an area where the eye can rest. You can't have the same level of detail and the same amount of value contrast and same size shapes in every area of your composition, or it gets confusing and the viewer doesn't really know where to go. So as I develop my paintings, I start with the larger shapes and I work to smaller shapes, and I start with lighter values and work to darker values. But most of the activity and most the strongest contrast I try to locate in the areas around my center of interest, so I can draw the viewer in and give them something to look at, and then try and lead them around the painting. Here's another example where I'm trying to put some of my strongest value in my center of interest. So I've got this dark valued quinacridone violet, which has a little bit of mauve mixed into it to make it a little deeper. And I'm trying to give a little bit more definition to the flower shapes. Not a lot, but a little bit more form, a little more edge to it in this area, so I can help draw the viewer in. I'm taking some of this dark purple tone, this mauve, out to the edge here. As I was lifting off with clear water before to make some linear shapes, I like to do the same thing with a dark value. I'll come in, I'll start to make some linear marks with my brush, and these marks help create a level of activity, and they can help create some directional flow to a painting. And as I make these marks, I interrupt the line. I lift my brush and pick it up and put it down as I'm doing this, and it just gives the suggestion that that linear shape is moving on top of and behind the other shapes in my composition. I just think it's a nice technique for adding some activity and adding some interest to the overall painting. I want to push some of this flower shape back. So to do that, I've got my wash brush and I've got a quinacridone coral, or a quinacridone coral mixed with a little bit of quinacridone violet. And it gives me a little darker tone. And I'm putting on top of some of this kind of pinkish area and trying to push some of that back a little bit and give some definition to what's in the foreground. So just some very simple brush strokes with a wash, and it just tones that area down and makes it feel like it's receding, and it helps those other shapes come forward. Here I'm using that dark green tone just to put some marks, some dark marks, to help, again, keep depth, or help create depth in this composition. Again, I want to send the area in the top left back further, so I've got a dark value mauve wash here, and I'm putting it over top of some of what's there, and I'm going to paint that whole area, that whole upper corner, with this dark value. And again, that sends that area more towards the background. That's my painting on the porch. I hope you enjoyed this. There's a lot of negative painting going on in it. If you want to give this a try yourself, you can download the photo reference in the sketch on the video page of my website, rsurwitzart.com. If you have questions, you can email me at contact@rsurwitzart@gmail.com. You can follow me on Facebook, and if you enjoy this, don't forget to like it, share it, and comment. Thanks for watching.